Welcome back to Reviews with Elaine, because I have opinions, and today's opinions will be about The Sign of the Four by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So this is the second of the Sherlock Holmes books, and I'm gonna admit before I get into this, I liked this one a lot less than I liked any of the other Sherlock Holmes stories I've read. So The Sign of the Four follows Sherlock and Watson on an odd little adventure where a lovely young woman shows up asking for their help. She has been sent a single large pearl every year since not long after her father mysteriously disappeared. Now she has received a letter asking for her to show up at a certain location at a certain time to receive the restitution owed her. Conveniently, the note also says she's allowed to bring 2 companions, so of course she's bringing Sherlock and Watson. This adventure will lead to murder, treachery, and maybe, just maybe, a large fortune from the East. And yeah, I'm not as fond of this one as the previous one at all. Like, I liked Studying Scarlet so much more, even with the random western in the middle. Sherlock comes across just a lot more callous in this book and mean. There's a lot more racism, like, oh my god. And yeah, that's a product of the time it was written, but it's not like that means we should just ignore it. And the story just didn't quite draw me in the way previous Sherlock Holmes stories drew me in. But that being said, it's not like there was nothing in it I liked. I still think the prose is surprisingly easy to read for the time period it was written in. I think it's masterfully done even when I don't like it. I still think there's a lot of depth to the characters and a lot of really interesting things going on in the relationship, particularly between Sherlock and Watson. Like, there is so many levels of this stuff that is so much fun to explore. But I'm going to start with talking about the problems. Problem number 1, Sherlock was a dick in this book. We start with him talking about how much he loves cocaine, and Watson is sitting there being like, I feel like I need to step in and discourage this. I need to explain all the reasons this is a bad idea, and Sherlock just sounds like a petulant child when he's basically just sitting there whining, but I'm bored. I have to do something because I'm bored. And Watson even tries to, distract him, to entertain him, and he's just a bit of a dick. He starts trash-talking Watson's writing to his face, and it's basically a full chapter of him just being an ass. Because yeah, it's this isolated chapter that doesn't have to do with anything else. The only information pertinent to the story we get is a reintroduction to the characters and the information that Sherlock is not currently actively on a case. And like, I understand, it's part of the character that Sherlock is always a bit of a whiny child when he's not on a case, but usually he's a vaguely likable whiny child, and in this one, he did not come across that way to me. And it doesn't help that, like, it's a bold and interesting, but maybe incorrect move to have the reintroduction of your characters. The very first time we see them in this book is Sherlock showing his least likable face, and it's right up front, it's a full chapter, it is basically just Doyle saying, hey, maybe don't like this character that much. Like, it really read to me the entire time I was reading that chapter like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle was pissed off that so many people really liked Sherlock in the first book, and he was like, no, I'm gonna show you he's a dick before we do anything else. And the thing is, Sherlock does have some really likable moments later on in the story. There's a moment when he's using a tracking dog and it loses the scent, and Sherlock is immediately like, oh, not his fault, he's still a good dog, he's kind, he's gentle to the dog, and Lord only knows being gentle to a dog is going to make me like someone. And the thing about that moment is it doesn't actually add anything to the story. Like, the plot could move on without it at all. It is a cul-de-sac. And basically all it does is show Sherlock working around a misstep, which, helps building his character as slightly more likable, and it makes Sherlock seem kinder to others. And there's also a moment later on when Sherlock plays the violin for an exhausted Watson to help him sleep, which was incredibly sweet. There are moments when he notices that Watson is, interested in a woman, and he purposely puts Watson in a position to spend more time with her, and it doesn't read like, oh, he didn't know what he was doing. It reads very much like this was a choice that Sherlock was making to set his friend up with this girl in these moments. And even our villain, when we finally get to him, Sherlock is surprisingly gentle and kind with him. He reassures him and promises him that he won't be punished for anything that he did not actively do. And all of these are really humanizing moments. And I get that a lot of people do present it as a simple dichotomy that Sherlock is a dick when he's bored, which he almost always is when he's not on a case, and is a good person when he has something to do. And, that is a very human trait. Being a dick when you're bored is something a lot of people are. But there are also a good number of passing moments in the middle of the case when Sherlock is an absolute dick. There are moments that he shows pretty much no empathy in really emotional moments. Moments he is unnecessarily misogynistic, which I would just dismiss as it being actually Doyle being misogynistic. But the thing is, Watson calls Sherlock out. He doesn't do it verbally, which would have been better, but he thinks about the fact that this is an inappropriate thing for Sherlock to have said. It's very clear that Doyle wants us to think in this moment, wow, Sherlock is being a dick. But overall, yeah, Sherlock is supposed to be a dick with flashes of kindness, and it's just that I feel like in this book, the balance between being a dick and those flashes of kindness were balanced incorrectly. We ended up tilting more into he's a dick than he has these moments of kindness. And that made me a lot less interested in the book in general. I am not someone who gets attached to books where I don't like the main character. And even though, yeah, Watson is our POV character, Sherlock is clearly the main character. I do think just from reading it that Doyle wants us to like Watson more than we like Sherlock. And let's just say the racism in this book does not help. Oh my god. It felt for a minute there like we could not go a single page without some dehumanizing language used against non-English characters. People from India are called beasts, monstrous, cruel, ugly, savages, animals, and cannibals. The treatment of the character from the Andaman Islands is by far the worst. It is egregious. And I've read horror novels that are kinder to their monsters than this book treats a human character. And even his quote-unquote friend treats him like a tool to be used and discarded when they're done with him. And there's a point that he explains that he's been making money by displaying his friend like a trained animal. And at least the Sikh characters are given some good traits. They are loyal and they keep their word, but they are also murderers. And one of them is described as a great beast at one point. And I get it. This is set in England, written by an English author in the late 1800s. The description of non-white characters is going to be odious. There's going to be a complete disregard of the horrors of colonialism. And the best you could possibly hope for is slight humanization and the noble savage trope. And so all of this is to be expected. But just because it's expected does not make it any less unpleasant to read, nor any less harmful. I think that many stories in this time period, that I've read from this time period, that is, you could cut a scene here or there, change a few words, maybe change a few descriptions, and cut a sentence or two about the glory of the English Empire, and you could end up with something that doesn't read exceptionally racist. But this one? No, the racism is an inherent part of the story. And I feel like it's wrong not to address that. You have to acknowledge that this book is fucking racist. And maybe that's why I just could not get drawn into the story. Or maybe there's something more. I'm honestly not entirely sure, because every time that I was starting to get into it, something racist would happen and it would throw me back out. But the good side of that is that it did make me more aware of the inner workings of the book. I was able to see it more from the outside and think more about the structure and the tools that the story itself is using. One of those structural things I want to talk about is the fact that the Sherlock Holmes books are not actually whodunits. Like, we think of mysteries as being these stories that, generally speaking, are whodunits. And the Sherlock Holmes books are really not. They are mysteries, there's no question about that. But it's very clear that there is no intention here for the reader to be able to figure out the mystery before the big reveal moment. You do get some clues, like, don't get me wrong, there are clues throughout the story, but many of them are so ridiculously tied to niche knowledge that the average reader wouldn't have, and that sometimes isn't even true in the real world. And, like, yes, you may be able to guess the ending, just the way you can guess the ending of any story ever. But I feel like mystery novels are usually specifically set up so that if you're paying attention and you have any deduction skills whatsoever, you will have all the information you need before the climax to figure out who done it. And that is in no way true here. I think, like, and I do think that is 100% on purpose. Like, this is not a mistake. We are given enough clues to solve some little bits, but almost everything has to be told to us by Sherlock or by the antagonist. And that's because the story really, 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 really wants us to accept this concept that Sherlock is practically superhuman in his knowledge, observation, and deduction. And the easiest way to portray him as superhuman is to make sure your reader cannot get to the solution before he does. And I think that's also why Sherlock is not like a lot of detectives that you see in other detective novels, holding their deductions off to the very end and, like, not telling you what they think is the solution until the big climax reveal. No, Sherlock does hold some things back, but he will tell Watson what certain details mean almost as soon as he points them out. And that way the reader doesn't have time to build up their own guesses. And it's all carefully shaped to make the reader completely reliant on Sherlock Holmes's intelligence and only his intelligence. Which was one of those things I barely noticed when I was drawn into the story enough to feel aligned with Watson, to feel like I'm there, and to, you know, like the characters. But without that, I was left with just the arrogance and pretension of Sherlock Holmes, which also made me hypercritical of his deductions. Because here's the thing, his deductions are not always, like, logical. Like, yes, they are always right in the structure of the book, because Sir Arthur Conan Doyle wanted them to be right. But there are a couple that don't quite jive with the real world. And, like, one of the ones that really bothered me, it's in the very first chapter. It's when Watson is trying desperately to distract Sherlock, and he gives him basically a test to, like, look at this watch and have Sherlock tell him what he can deduct from the person who carried the watch just from looking at the watch. And among many other things, Sherlock Holmes says the man who carried the watch was obviously a drunk, and his observation that proves this is there are scratches around the keyhole on the watch, which clearly showed that the man was drunk when winding it, because why else would a man have unstable hands? And I literally was immediately like, palsy? Nerves? Bad eyesight? Like, there are so many reasons a man might have unstable hands that it's preposterous to jump straight to, he must have been a drunk. And, like, it's also not one of those that you could be like, oh, well, you know, you hear hooves, you think horses, not zebras. Because palsy and bad eyesight are just as likely as someone drinking too much. And it's not a big deal in the book. This doesn't even pertain to the plot of the book. But because the book is so damn sure that Sherlock Holmes is never wrong, any flaw in his logic is going to catch your eye. And especially when he's being annoying, you sort of want to be like, you're wrong, fuck you, you're wrong. Or at least I am. I also want to very briefly address the romance in this book, because yeah, this one has a romance. And it was cute, it was sweet. I admit it is so aggressively thrown in that it almost feels like Doyle shouting, no, these men are not in love with each other! Look! Watson's in love with a woman! But also, there were moments I wanted to throw the book down and just shout, you met her 3 days ago, you cannot be in love with her! And, like, objectively, that's absurd, because most books, characters fall in love way too quickly. Like, it's not rare for two characters to fall head over heel in love in a couple of days. Hell, I have written books where characters fall head over heels in love in a couple of days. But I think it felt more noticeable in this book because the conversations and moments that the two lovers have together are so focused on the mystery that it doesn't feel like they have time to get to know each other. Like, there's a sweet little moment where Watson reaches out and holds her hand, and that's sweet, and that felt like the budding of something. But when literally, like, a day later he's proposing marriage, I'm like, friend, you have not had a normal conversation with this woman. What are you doing? But on the other side of that, I really absolutely loved the way Sherlock handled his friend falling in love. Like, it's really cute. He's actually helpful. He's actually kind. And because of that, I'll give it a huge pass because I really like that. And I also wanted to mention, I said earlier that the antagonist often is the one that reveals details of the big reveal, and yeah, that's part of at least 3 of the Sherlock stories that I've read so far. And I will admit, I've read 2 recently, and I read like 5 almost a decade ago, and I barely remember them. But at least as my memory serves, at least a couple of those, and the ones I've read now, there's just a moment when the bad guy basically says, "You caught me, copper! Here, have all the details you need to convict me." And it's fucking hilariously unbelievable, but it's also interesting on a storytelling level, because these confessions are presented as stories, told from the point of view of the criminal, and told with far more details than you would expect a normal person to tell stories. Like, these are written as if they are short stories and inserted inside these novellas. And so we end up with a story inside of a story where the antagonist of the greater story is the protagonist of the inner story. And it's natural for the reader to develop a deeply empathy-driven relationship with these antagonists as they're telling their stories, because they are telling their stories. And it's more noticeable with the last one that I reviewed, Steady and Scarlet, because that antagonist was truly wronged. And it's pretty clear that the book itself wants you to side with him and to actually agree that what he was doing in killing people wasn't necessarily 100% bad. But here, it's more interesting, because there are so many signals we are going to get the same kind of similar situation. Sherlock shows a good amount of respect to the antagonist once he's caught. It's established before he's caught that the antagonist did not intend the victim of this book to have been killed. He's given this almost heroic description in the moment that Sherlock and Watson catch up to him, and we have an unusual number of moments in this book where Sherlock speaks with empathy about criminals in general. And the antagonist's narrative starts out with the same amount of tragic, heroic tone as the guy from A Study in Scarlet. He admits his early faults, he shows his life in this light of a man who's just trying his best and making some mistakes, but trying to be better. And then, in one paragraph, it shifts. He makes an unconscionable decision, and it comes before the moment we expect. Like, going into that little confession, it's safe to assume that most readers would expect the choice they disagree with to be the one that directly led to the death in this book. But then we find out about a crime we had no reason to even guess had happened. And our antagonist is 100% guilty of it. And he tries his best to say, "Oh, it was the only option I had," but that's obviously untrue. He's just being a selfish prick. And Doyle makes the absolutely masterful choice in that moment to pull out of his narrative and to show us the room. Show us the other characters. Show us Sherlock and Watson and the police guy all watching this confession. And our actual protagonists get to hear the story with us, and we see their expressions of distaste. And it's simple, it's straightforward, it's not complex, but it gives us this break that we need as readers to step out of this man's point of view, this antagonist's point of view, and go, no, really, this guy's a dick. And everything he describes from this point on is pretty selfish, it's cruel, it builds up off of that moment. And so we go from siding with him to going, okay, no, really, take him off to the pokey. And immediately afterwards, he gets taken off to jail. It is brilliantly shaped. So overall, yeah, there's a lot of really masterful work in this book. I just wish Doyle had handled the balance of how much we like Sherlock versus dislike Sherlock the same way he had handled the balance of how much we like versus dislike the antagonists. And also, you know, I wish there was about 110% less racism in this book. Like, why is there so much racism in this book? But yeah, I will be reading more Sherlock Holmes books. I still have like 7 of them up here, and this definitely was not enough to turn me off of the series.